So I think it was late elementary school or middle school when I was first introduced to horror movies. I hate horror movies now. I think it's because I was traumatized when I was so young and watched them. But the whole premise of the idea of a horror movie, they're all kind of the same, is that eventually some little innocent thing turns into some crazy demon and eats people. So you'll have this little child, this little toddler in some scene, and all of a sudden its eyes bug out of its head, and it has these awful fangs, and it hurts somebody. Or some little grandmother all of a sudden turns into the Hulk and starts dismembering people. That's what these horror films are like. And so I started thinking about temptation in terms of horror films. Is that I just look out, if I see this little puppy, I know that it's going to grow up into this big monster and eat my face. And that's how I look at all temptation now. Because see, this is what I think, is that we need to take temptation seriously. God took temptation pretty seriously. He takes sin seriously. And so I should take it as seriously as he does. And it's interesting, Proverbs is all about overcoming the foolishness in your life. Now, somebody told me this week, they said, if you think you didn't do anything stupid when you were young, you're still doing stupid things. And that's probably right. I mean, because we all can go back to the things that tempted us, and perhaps even from our youth, we still carry some of the same vulnerabilities today. And that's what Proverbs is trying to equip us for, to be wise, so we don't have to fall captive to our temptations. Now, I want to make sure I always give you the background. Here's King Solomon. God had asked him what it was that he wanted. He'd grant him anything he wanted, and he said, I want the ability to discern, to lead my people. In other words, I want wisdom. And God not only granted him wisdom, he granted him wealth and honor. And here's the key verse in Proverbs. If you haven't memorized it yet, I hope you'll memorize it, because this is the one that guides us all the way through. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. So you can see we're doing the contrast here between someone who fears the Lord and someone who's foolish, someone who is undisciplined. That's what we're passionately pursuing in our series, and we're going to end the series today with a story. And this story comes out of Proverbs chapter 7. So if you brought a Bible or you have a device and you want to turn there and follow along with it, you can. I'll put it on the screen as well. I don't usually read big stories, long stories, but this one you need the whole thing to capture the reality. Now, previously we talked about how we have to pursue the knowledge of God in our work, in our relationships, with our wealth, in everything that we're about. We want to pursue what God says is wise and good. But temptation is here to tell us or give us an attraction away from what we know to be moral and right and good. And so as we think about that definition, let's try to unpack this story together. And today we'll talk about temptation's deception, temptation's destruction, and temptation's defeat. Here I am trying to make it easy for you again. So here we go. Proverbs chapter 7, beginning with verse 6. Here's the story. While I was at the window of my house looking through the curtain, I saw some naive young men, and one in particular who lacked common sense. He was crossing the street near the house of an immoral woman, strolling down the path by her house, and it was at twilight in the evening, as deep darkness fell. The woman approached him, seductively dressed and sly of heart. She was brash, rebellious type, never content to stay at home. And she is often in the streets and markets, soliciting at every corner. And she threw her arms around him and kissed him. And with a brazen look, she said, I've just made my peace offerings and fulfilled my vows. You're the one I'm looking for. I came out to find you, and here you are. My bed is spread with beautiful blankets, with colored sheets of Egyptian linen. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh and aloes and cinnamon. Come, let's drink our fill of love until morning. Let's enjoy each other's caresses, for my husband is not home. He's away on a long trip. He has taken a wallet full of money with him and won't return until later this month. So she seduced him with her pretty speech and enticed him with her flattery. And he followed her at once like an ox going to slaughter. He was like a stag caught in a trap, awaiting the arrow that would pierce its heart. He was like a bird flying into a snare, little knowing it would cost him his life. I mean, you don't have to read any Harlequin romances. You don't have to read any novels. Just pick up the Bible. And there's the story. The second part of wisdom's definition, you may remember, is knowing what to do with what you know. And that's the problem. We can be wise and be able to tell the difference between true and fake, good and bad, right and wrong. But the question is then, do we know what to do with what we know? And this is the story that Solomon gives us to help us understand that we are tempted every day, every moment, to do something in contrast to what we know is true, good, and right. And so Solomon's personal story even shows us that you can have all the wisdom in the world and still mess up. And so he gives us a warning, and he helps us to understand temptation's deception. You see, Solomon's story shows how temptation makes deceptive promises that lead to failure. And I want to just show you, like real quick, in the story, I mean, basically, here are 3 deceptive promises that Solomon points out to us that we need to understand. The first is a promise of correction. What does that mean? Well, it means that here's temptation saying to us, I'm going to correct God. God is wrong. There's something wrong with what God has told you, or what you know to be moral or good or ethical or right. And so it begins to challenge what you understand to be good and pure and right for you and right for God. And look at the verses right before the story that we read in chapter 7, verse 2. Obey my commands and live. Guard my instructions as you guard your own eyes. Tie them on your fingers as a reminder. Write them deep within your heart. He gives that advice, and then he goes on and says, here's this story of this naive boy who starts wandering around on the streets in the wrong places and gets seduced by this seductress. And he's caused to believe then at that moment everything that he ever understood, like what Solomon just told him there, to write the scripture on your heart. Everything you ever understood, I'm not sure that's really what's right. I think we should correct God at this point. He's contrasting foolish choices with the wise choices of those who've made God their number one priority. And so let me just give you an example of this in the Bible. After creation, one of the first stories we read in Genesis is the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. And in that whole discussion between Eve and this tempting serpent in the garden around the one tree they were told not to eat from, here's what the tempter said. Did God really say that? I mean, when Eve told him, we're not supposed to eat from this tree, did God really say that? And Eve even replies correctly, well, he said if we ate from it, we would die. And then he lies to her. You won't die. You see, God needs corrected. That's what the idea of temptation is, a promise that's unfulfilled. You know, I've learned this about myself. I look back on my life, and honestly, I was just a bad kid. I was a bad kid for my parents. And it's because I had drawn this conclusion that my parents were either wrong or just dumb. But they were never right, and I always was, and I saw it as my mission in life to correct them, and inevitably I was the one getting corrected. And you see, here's the thing. Some people never grow up, and they realize that they could be easily duped because they begin to doubt that God's words, God's direction, God's commands are even right or good or best. And that's the first promise of deception that temptation brings to you. But here's a second promise of deception, is that you'll be fulfilled by what it is that you're being tempted to do. In other words, this will provide something that's missing in your life. So look at the seductress in the story. What does she try to get him to come to her for? You are special, and I've been looking for you. You deserve me. We deserve each other. Look at 16 to 18. You'll enjoy this. And verse 21, all of this is so amazing. What an incredible experience we're about to have if you just give in to my call into your life. Now remember, the seductress is the metaphor for any temptation in your life. He's not limiting it to this. It's any temptation in your life calling out to you saying, if you just do it this way, contrary to what you know God has said, it will bring you the most fulfillment. Now, whatever you're missing or wanting, whatever you feel like has been left out of your life, you'll find it in me, she's saying. And so look, let me just make up my own metaphor, my own story, because honestly, it happens to me all the time in talking to people in our church and outside our church. But here's the story. Married man goes to gym, meets married woman. And at first, they just notice each other, but pretty soon, after a few weeks, they're running on treadmills beside each other, or they're spotting each other on weights. And all of a sudden, they're starting to talk more, and they're beginning to talk about personal things in their life, and they begin to confess that, I'm not fulfilled in this way in my marriage or that way in my marriage. And all of a sudden, they start to believe that this person who they're opening up to will somehow be able to fulfill them or fill what's missing in every other area of their marriage. And so they begin to be attracted to each other until ultimately they meet after workout. They go for some coffee, it's just coffee, and then ultimately end up in a relationship. Happens all the time. It happens all the time all over America. And why is it? Because the belief is, or the lie is, that somehow I'll be fulfilled if I give in to this temptation. Something I'm missing will be brought to me. That's exactly what she was saying to him. I'm the one who's going to let you drink love till morning. I'm the one who's going to give you what you're looking for. The second deception, fulfillment. And then the third deception, and here I want you to get this. It's promised anonymity. Promise that you'll never be found out. No one will know. Look, you saw it there in the story, right? Verse 19. My husband is gone. No one will know. He's got his wallet full. He's not going to be home for a month. So because no one will know, he won't know. Come on and take advantage of this. What's the metaphor? That temptation is the strongest when we believe that we're going to be doing it in secret. When we believe that no one will find out, temptation is powerful. That's why pornography is such a powerful temptation on people, because they can watch it in the privacy of their own home. They believe they'll never be found out. It begins to creep into their mind that somehow this will fulfill, and it's a promise unkept, until ultimately they experience it. And it's amazing how I've learned in my conversations with people that the first lie often leads to the second lie and the third lie, and pretty soon a person is feeling like they're a fugitive being chased and trying to keep all of their secrets secret. And it becomes gymnastics in trying to protect the fact that this happened. Men and women, we begin to believe the lie when we're tempted that somehow no cell phones are involved and no one's going to be recording this and it won't go viral and therefore it's all okay. And that's the deception of temptation. That ultimately the promise that you will be able to keep this secret is defeated, and ultimately you're found out. But I want you to know this, that even if you would never be found out by your family, your friends, work, whatever it is that you're tempted to do, know this, that the God who made you and loves you knows everything you're thinking and everything you're doing. It's never done in secret. That's the lie of temptation, is that somehow your temptation will be kept secret from him if you give in to it. Now, here are those three promises that temptation can offer, and three deceptions that it tries to give you to believe that somehow you can get by with whatever it is you're tempted with. Now, I want you to pause right here, and I want to ask you, what is your greatest temptation? What is your greatest temptation to do something immoral or unethical or just flat out wrong? And I want you to think in terms of those deceptions that I just laid before you. Have you believed any of them? See, here's what you need to understand. God takes your temptation seriously. He takes your sin seriously. And do you want to know how I know how seriously he takes all of that? Just look at the cross. Just look at the fact that he had to come to this world and put on your flesh and die on the cross in your behalf to take that kind of punishment. Don't be deceived. God takes sin seriously. And don't let the smooth talk of deception draw you into unwise choices. Remember, temptation is a demon disguised as a cute puppy that wants to eat your face off. And that's what I want you to understand. Whatever visual helps you, get that visual. Because here's where Solomon ends his story with a warning. Jump down to verse 24. Here's what he says. Listen to me, my sons. Pay attention to my words. Don't let your hearts stray away toward her. Don't wander down her wayward path, for she has been the ruin of many. Many men have been her victims. Her house is the road to the grave. Her bedroom is the den of death. You see, all of temptation's deception is to lead you to temptation's destruction of your life. Now, here's a statement I want you to hear. Every destroyed life starts with the first bad choice. Hear me. Every destroyed life starts with the first bad choice. That's what makes temptation seem so innocent. We think of it as one little thing, one little compromise. Remember how Solomon referred to the young man as naive? Well, maybe he was inexperienced and that's why he was naive, but sometimes his own self-confidence could be what brings him down. It's his own self-confidence, how smart he thinks he is, or how strong he thinks he is, that makes him think that he could wander into places that he should never be wandering. Temptation is often characterized by rationalization. It's just one time. It's just a small amount. No one is getting hurt. No one will know. We rationalize, and it's what ultimately destroys us. Many are the broken lives of those who choose to believe that one little sin won't matter. Many lives broken because of that rationalization. So say it again with me. Every destroyed life starts with the first bad choice. And that's what you want to keep telling yourself. The seductress in Solomon's story, for she has been the ruin of many, and many men have been her victims. You know, often we talk about the promises of God in the Bible, and we like to quote all of those that are really positive and make us happy. You know, my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches in Christ Jesus. I like that one. Don't you like that one? That's a great promise, and it makes me feel so happy, so positive. And yet, I think I need to also memorize the warnings that are promises in the Bible as well. Like this warning before us. Her house is the road to the grave. Her bedroom is the den of death. I came to encourage you today. But really, it's to remind you that this is what temptation is in your life. This is what it's trying to take you to. A life of death and destruction. And every destroyed life starts with a single bad choice. The adulteress is the symbol of any temptation in your life. That's what's important for you to understand. What is your greatest temptation? What vulnerability is your tempter trying to exploit today, in this moment, in this time in your life? What weakness is he going after in you? Now tell yourself, I will not let that thing take me to the grave. I will not let that thing destroy my life. I will not let it win over me. God, help me to trust that you are what is true. You are what is good. You are what is right. Because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is what ultimately leads you to wisdom and self-control and self-discipline. Stephanie and I when we were in Ohio, we were part of a tiny denomination, and lots of little churches. And in the past couple years, one of those little churches had a bookkeeper. She volunteered to do it, and at the same time was elected to do it in her congregation. She said yes. And she just wanted to be helpful. And, these little churches, everybody just trusts each other. And, we're all good people, right? And so the pressure of her own debt got to her. And she was counting the money. And they didn't have all of the types of things in place that we do here, where you have multiple people who do that. She was doing that by herself, counting the money. And she thought, this would really help me to just if I got out of debt, then I'm going to pay it all back. That's what was in her mind. And so she began to take cash from the offering to try to pay off her debts. And she was failing miserably at it. And it was happening over years and years of being the bookkeeper. And listen to me, men and women, $250,000 later, she was caught. And her life was destroyed. Destroyed by the first bad choice to take a little bit of cash out of the offering plate. Now you see, you think it's just that one thing, that one time, and you think, oh, it's just innocent and no one will know. And in the end, it can ultimately take you down to the destructive bed of the seductress. You can go to death and the grave with a destroyed life. But here's the good news I want to tell you. Temptation does not require failure. Let's all understand that. You do not have to be a perpetual spiritual failure in your life. As a matter of fact, that's the good news. Look at Proverbs 7:1, the very beginning of what would have been the whole reading of the passage. It actually started with, "My son, keep my words and store up my commands within you." You see, we look at temptation's deception and destruction, and we ultimately say to ourselves, what I need in my life is temptation's defeat. What I need is to win these battles that come into my life. You don't have to fail. You can defeat temptation with the powerful weapons of the Spirit. I mean, it's what Proverbs is all about, to awaken you to that reality. First, to awaken you to your own vulnerabilities, your own weaknesses, but then ultimately to awaken you to the fact that you have been given many spiritual weapons to win this battle. Once you admit temptation is real and serious, you can use your powerful weapons to defeat it. Now, let's go back to the Garden of Eden, shall we? Let's all go back there together. And when you look at that story, you realize that only one thing was prohibited for Adam and Eve. One tree, one thing, that was it. That's the only thing they had to avoid. Everything else was pure and perfect and prosperous and awesome. And here's this one tree. And what's interesting of that is that Adam and Eve should have never been in close proximity to the tree. It's close proximity that enabled them to hear the voice of the tempter. Are you hearing me, people? It's close proximity to temptation that caused them to hear the voice of the tempter. And that's why James says it this way: submit yourselves then to God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Remember that? Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. The first and most important way to defeat temptation in your life is to die to yourself. First, make a decision right now that, in fact, I do believe God knows what's best. I do believe God is true. I do believe that this word is in my best interest and what is right and good for everyone in the world. I need to make that decision first and die to myself and say, I'm not going to live according to my feelings, my flesh, my passions. I'm going to live according to what God says is true. It starts there. And then run as far away as you possibly can from those things that tempt you. When you think in terms of eternity, men and women, This is just an absolute millisecond. Millisecond. And you want to live for the long term. You want to live in the kingdom of God. And it starts with making that decision to die to myself and run as fast as I can away from the tree in my life so that I don't hear the voice. I should never be in the neighborhood of those things that are most tempting to me. Does that mean that I can avoid temptation? I can make every effort to myself. But there are more weapons to offer than just fleeing. Solomon's metaphor, don't walk down her street, that's the first. But let me just try to give you 4 quick steps to defeat temptation. And it starts with this: inventory your vulnerabilities. I mean, it starts with you just admitting where you're weak, being honest about where you're weak, to yourself, to God, and to others. We'll say more about that in a minute. Number 2, stay away from tempting places. We're not here to dance with the devil on this earth, men and women. We're here to run toward God and away from those things. And we should be telling ourselves that. You know, you say, that, here you go. You say, dude, you are so legalistic. You know, lighten up, cool down, whatever word you want to use. And I'm saying, look, I don't want to be even close to those areas of weakness. I want to run as far away from them as I can. And when you play around in the neighborhood, that's when you end up falling. Number 3, fill your mind with truth. You see, you're getting messages planted in your brain nonstop every second of every day. And many of those messages are in direct conflict with what God wants for your life. And if you're not intentional about filling your mind with the Word of God, filling your heart with the Spirit of God in prayer, if you're not intentional about that, trust me, you'll begin to believe the stuff of the world, the stuff in contrast to God. And so you should be intentional about filling your mind with that which is truth so that you can do battle against that which is lies and fake. And 4th, fight with an army. Surround yourself with people who share your value of passionately pursuing God with everything you are. And give them permission to point out to you, number 1, your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities. Ask them what they see as weaknesses in you so that you can begin to focus on them and be intentional about building fences around yourself to protect yourself. Remember, we're talking about being wise. No fools in this room. Rather, people who want nothing more than God's Spirit and God's honor to be what drives them in life. And so you recognize that, so you accept the fact you have these weaknesses, you have these vulnerabilities, and you lay them out there for the Lord and for your team of people who are going to help you resist temptation. But when I want to remind you of this, if you feel shame today because of failure in your life, you feel guilt because you know that you've been a slave to some temptations that have held you captive, I want you to hear this. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. Here's what he's saying. Look, in everything that you are, where you've crashed and burned, you have Jesus Christ to forgive you. He has taken your sin upon the cross. He gives you a fresh start, a new life, a new beginning, and a promise that He resides in you to give you power over your temptations, your vulnerabilities, your weaknesses. The most important step toward wisdom is faith in the one who is the wisdom of God, Jesus Christ. I mean, that's where this has been going in the whole series, is that if you want wisdom, get Jesus. Choose Jesus. Receive the grace and mercy of Jesus in your life. Maybe you've done some foolish things and you're experiencing regret. God offers you that grace and forgiveness and fresh start today, right now. And he says, receive it. It's the wisest decision that you will ever make. To die to yourself and embrace his Spirit and his word. It's what you can trust. He's what you know is true and good and right. And men and women, when you put your faith in him, when you receive his grace and mercy, then you will have Christ, who is the wisdom of God, and you, in fact, will be wise.